Hello, my name is Trevor and this is Veritas Bible Study. Today we're talking about Genesis 31 through 35. And we have kind of an unnatural division between our last reading and this reading, partly because we couldn't really assign more reading in the last reading, and we wanted to take time in this reading to kind of cover this very kind of important event that takes place. And before we get to this actual reading, we're going to do a little bit of review in the last reading, some of the things that weren't covered in the previous video for a specific purpose, and that is because that this video really is going to be about Jacob, his wives, and his children. And that's primarily where we're going to focus with this particular video. So we find out last week that Jacob meets this Rachel. And Rachel is beautiful, comely. She's everything that Jacob sees and more in a wife. And so he meets with Laban. And Laban, he negotiates with, because he's going to work for Laban. And Laban says, okay, you want to marry my daughter? I will have you work for me for 7 years. And Jacob goes, okay, I'll do 7 years. Yeah, I'll work for you for 7 years. That'll work out just fine. So he works for Laban for 7 years, and then he marries who he thinks is Rachel, but has a little bit of a problem, and he ends up marrying Leah. And he comes to Laban and says, he's really upset about the situation. And Laban says very simply, he says, look, I don't know about the culture that you come from, but where I come from, we marry away the eldest or the elder daughters first. Whoa. Now, there's something that's big here that's often missed, and that is that birth order. Think about this. Birth order is finally catching up with this Jacob. That yes, he's wrestled, and he's even done some very unethical things, at least in our understanding of the commandments and in our now at this time understanding of where we are at. Of course, Jacob didn't have the benefit of all of that. But things are catching up to Jacob. And Laban knows who this Jacob is due to previous dealings. So he's not necessarily a fool. Jacob has met his match. And Jacob is going to have to learn that sometimes you got to follow the correct way of doing things. And you can't just trick everybody and wrestle everybody to the ground just to get your way. And it's a tough lesson for Jacob, a real tough lesson, because the next thing is that he works another 7 years just to marry Rachel. And not only does he also marry Rachel, but immediately there becomes a certain kind of intrigue, or rather division between his wives, kind of rivalry in a sense. And this rivalry kind of leads to, the birth of some children by one, and there's kind of a barrenness upon the other, to, then fruitfulness for the other and barrenness for the other, and they switch places then and again, there and again. And then they even bring in, and we thought that they've learned this lesson before, that Jacob's aware of these things, but they even bring in their maidservants again, each party. And they have Jacob sleep with one maidservant, and then the other wife has Jacob sleep with the other maidservant, and having this kind of duel of children. And, it kind of leads, as one might read and understand, to be a kind of division in the home. I mean, I can't even imagine this kind of rivalry taking place in this manner. And the kind of division that would be led from this kind of moment. But essentially, each of these children, each of these sons, becomes a father in their own right of the 12 tribes. Or at least if you count correctly, there's 11 here. Another son is yet to be born. But ultimately, we're going to have the 12 tribes. And of course, there's a daughter named Dinah, born by Leah. And as many know about families, especially of a larger size, I suppose, and especially a family of a larger size that is so unbalanced, Dinah is a special daughter. Someone that probably all the sons would have been looking out for or being there for in one way or another. It's natural in a sense. It's in the blood. And it's kind of inexplicable in a sense. But there is that kind of brotherly kind of care that naturally comes of a brother for his sister. And in this case, there's 12 brothers. Something to note as well in this, each of these 12 sons of Israel, of Jacob, they basically, they don't directly, by lineage, become directly the 12 tribes for, eternity. There are some tribes that combine, there are some that divide, and there are some that quite simply disappear. I'm not going to go through all of them right now because we're going to come upon the history of the different tribes as we go and make our way through the rest of the Bible itself. But be that as it may, just note that the 12 sons of Jacob really kind of become, Israel itself, the kingdom of Israel. So, the next very interesting point is we come into chapter 32, verse 22, where Jacob wrestles. He's going ahead to meet Esau, his brother, who he's wrestled with. And I think now at this time, after his years with Laban, has come out the wiser. You ever have a family member or someone that you know who had kind of a wild youth in a sense, and then in later years they kind of come to, and things are set differently, and yet they still have the past that they had to contend with. I think this is something that Jacob has going for him in a sense, and he comes to these waters at Peniel, and he wrestles with this figure. And he wrestles and wrestles and wrestles until the figure says, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And that's curious. Jacob must have had a sense for who this individual is, based on the wrestling. And the question is, what is meant by wrestling? What is signified here by wrestling? Who is it that we are wrestling? And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Tell me, I pray, your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." And the sun rose up as he passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh. And if you remember, because he was grabbed there in his thigh. So it's this really fascinating interaction. He's wrestling with God and with men. So what kind of wrestling is he doing in that moment, though? Well, he recognizes some kind of divinity, whether it is an angel that he's wrestling or whether it is God himself that he is wrestling in a figurative kind of way, or perhaps in kind of a literal way. Who knows? In this, the essential point is that he's wrestling in some way with God. That's the essential core of this point. And because that is who he is. Remember, your name in Israel means a lot more than simply what people call you. It is your essence as a being. And if you have someone's name, you have some kind of dominion or some kind of control over them. And that is why principally they do not have God's name, and why God refuses to give his name. Even when Moses asks for God's name, he says, "I am who I am," or I am. And then later they ask Jesus who his name is, and he says, "I tell you, I am." And that kind of reveals his divine nature in a sense. So there's a lot going on here. But essentially what we're getting to is that Jacob wrestles, and God recognizes that. And God blesses him for his holy perseverance. He perseveres where God sets him to persevere. Yes, he takes a loss. And yet he keeps striving. He keeps working at it. And it's by that striving and that holy perseverance that God blesses him. That is what kind of holiness that God calls us towards. We are not going to be perfect right out of the gate. There's no way. And in fact, some people say, you know what? Church is for hypocrites. Church is for hypocrites, not for me. But the reality is, this is where the rubber meets the road. True saints, the people that draw others into the church, the people that show that it is actually possible to commune with God and to bring about God's providence, not just on their own, but cooperating with the grace given and being so at one with the Holy Father's, with God the Father's will, with the Holy Spirit's will, with Jesus' will, that their lives transform the places in which they live and operate. It is this perseverance. They didn't start out saints. It is this kind of perseverance that God recognizes and blesses. You see, hypocrisy, it's part of the picture. But if you're really concerned with holiness, it really has nothing to do with it. Why? Because if you're intent upon holiness, upon following God's will, you're going to necessarily mess up. But if you have that holy perseverance, it's not going to matter that you messed up. What's going to matter is that you continually wrestle for your salvation, that you continually wrestle both God and men. And you may not always get it right. You may be wrestling for the wrong reasons. But eventually, if you keep in God's view, in your mind, and if you keep to the commands, we have it easier because we have the commands and we have the sacraments. If we keep to those things, God will give us those blessings. God will continue to bless us. Just like God blesses Jacob here. It is because of his perseverance, his wrestling with God, his wrestling with others, that God blesses. So we have kind of Jacob and Esau kind of parting ways in a sense, very carefully and gingerly. But then there comes this moment with Shechem. And really, it's something that has to be brought up because, as I mentioned before, the kind of family that Jacob would have at this point with his quarreling wives and sons from, all different parts of the family, and all different kinds of relatedness to each other, and the strife between Leah and Rachel. There comes this moment where Shechem defiles Dinah. And it's really a very despicable act. Where essentially Dinah is taken and raped, and it's really a very terrible event for this family. And yet these brothers, in response, gather together despite relation, gathered together to avenge her, especially upon Shechem. And while it is a time of great tragedy, a time of great sadness, it is also a time of great unity, in a time in which the sons really begin to be as a nation, as a people, as a family. It's not a highlight that you look forward to, but as I say, remembering, and it's coming up here soon, September 11th. It is a great tragedy, and no one smiles upon that day, but we all do remember the kind of unity and the kind of togetherness that day in particular brought. One upon which, when we talk about it, it's in the context of where were we and how we spent our days in the shadows of that terrible day. Now, here we see that that same kind of effect is brought about in their family with this here terrible tragedy in this moment of great sorrow. But, as I mentioned before, it's important to understand Dinah's relation to her brothers. And of course, Dinah was born by Leah. Leah was her mother. But her brothers respond to that terrible moment. So, this is our reading for today. And I think it's important to go forth and to recognize what it means to have that holy perseverance, to focus like a laser beam upon God, and despite, our many failures, the many tragedies that we have, to still keep that laser beam focus, to stick with it, to pull ourselves back up by our bootstraps and keep going. It's not hypocrisy if we continue to work at it, if we continue to persevere. I think the only real hypocrisy in the Christian faith is the hypocrisy of saying, you know what, I'm done. I am righteous. I've made it. It's just like the difference is brought up in other videos between the tax collector and the proud Pharisee who looks up into heaven and says, his prayers, many long prayers, and the tax collector who knows his sins well, looks to the ground, beats his chest, and says, Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. We need to be like that tax collector. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, a sinner, and yet I will persevere by your grace. Pray for that grace. Continue working at it. Salvation is something that is worked out over a lifetime. And yet, as Jesus says, we are not sure of the time that we will be called home. And we need to be wary of that and be hopeful for the day that the Lord calls each of us home. And we need to continue the good fight like Jacob, who wrestled God and man. This is Veritas. Peace in all good things. Have a great day.